All right, so we are here with Megan Ramos. And Megan, I know you don't know this and you don't know me very well, but I know of you because I've been listening to you for a while now. Probably going to get emotional, and like this is super weird because you don't even know me, but you actually were a person who, of course, here come the tears, who changed my life very significantly because it was in 2016. I had been struggling with PCOS for years and I could not get to the root of it. My doctor told me I had to take the pill, there was no cure, and that I had to lose weight, yet I was struggling to lose weight no matter what I did. And I was just for years just trying to figure it out, and I couldn't. And so I happened to be listening to a podcast of yours with Dr. Jason Fung, and I was driving at the time, and you said, PCOS is the diabetes of the ovaries. And I almost drove my car off the road almost. But the fact that there was a blood sugar and insulin connection, I never knew that that was at the root of the PCOS, even though they said, oh, there's a lot of people who have insulin resistance. I was like, I don't have diabetes. That doesn't relate. So just hearing you say that completely changed the entire trajectory of my life, because I started to address my blood sugar and insulin issues. My PCOS went away. Like I don't have any symptoms of it at all anymore. And I decided to go to nutritional therapy school. And now I help other people with their blood sugar and insulin so they can do the same. So I just wanted to start off with a really awkward introduction, but thank you so much for the work that you do.
Well, thank you so much for sharing. It really means a lot. My whole life, I just wanted to help people. I got into the medical field when I was pretty young after watching my mom suffer, and people just treat her symptoms with meds that cause more illnesses and more symptoms that they treated with more meds. And no one really looked at the root cause of the disease. And it's just such an honor to be able to hear stories like yours. It's just a real true privilege. I feel like the luckiest person every day when I wake up, that the work that we do is really truly changing lives. We're told there's nothing that we can do. I was 14 when I was diagnosed with PCOS. There's nothing you can do. Maybe you'll grow out of it because you're young and I was quote unquote thin at the time, but I wasn't, I was a little sack of fat at the time, with a low BMI, but I wasn't healthy. So, and I think the best thing we can all do is to try to help out as many people. So any individuals asking, what can we do? Learn, lead by example, and try to help people in your community. So thank you so much. Cause this is a whole career change.
Yep. Whole career change. Yeah. I retired from speech therapy. I was able to retire in late 2020, thanks to the pandemic, actually, because I was working from home. And so now I specialize in blood sugar regulation and help other people who were once in my shoes, because I know it's a really dark place to be, especially when someone with a white coat is telling you that there is no cure for what you have and you have to take a pharmaceutical medication that that you didn't tolerate well. And just like you said, those Band-Aid approaches are just, they're so, for some people, they're a godsend at certain times. Of course, pharmaceuticals are, but they're also so harmful for so many other people, and the way that they're prescribed and used, that they're not this panacea, and they don't lead to healing. They don't lead to the results that we want. So what got you, I know you said that you had PCOS, but what else and the story with your mom, what else sort of drove you to get into this world of fasting?
Yeah. So my mom was really sick with these weird conditions that took like 10 years to finally diagnose and figure out. So I grew up sleeping at hospitals with her being sick and being a little bit more health conscious as a kid because of it. And I had an uncle die when I was 9. He was 36 and he died from his third heart attack at 36. And I was the
That's
oldest
how old
cousin.
I am. Wow.
Yeah, I just turned 38 a couple weeks back. So it's just crazy to think of it. But even at 9, I understood that that was really young. And like, I felt so bad for my cousins because the oldest one would have some memories, but the middle and the youngest, they don't have any memories of their dad at all. And it's just hard, because someone like me who had, 9 solid years of memories with this guy, and, they can listen to some voice recordings and some home tapes, and that's about it. So very young, like I was just surrounded by illness and became a little bit more interested in health and wellness, and primarily disease prevention. And I knew from a young age that, obesity led to a lot of the diseases like my uncle had. Like my uncle was very sick, overweight individual. So I was always conscious of my weight and went through that kind of adolescent struggle without really figuring out how to control my weight in a healthy way. But my BMI was classified as underweight. But when I was having some health issues, and at 12, I was diagnosed with fatty liver. And at 14, I was diagnosed with PCOS. And the doctors, like, I just remember the PCOS diagnosis, like, but your weight is good. And you're eating like low fat foods. Like I would totally go that extreme because of what I knew. You're eating all of the right things, in that perspective. And, as I got older, my diet definitely went down the toilet a bit, but when I was younger, I was more conscious of it. And then I kind of felt like, I think that kind of broke me, the PCOS diagnosis, because it's just like, wow, I'm supposed to be doing everything right. And it's not going right. And I kind of let my diet just be that of a normal teenager at that point. And I let go of kind of my obsessive control of it. So that's a good thing in some respects, but not necessarily a good thing in other respects. So replacing, low fat salads with Happy Meals didn't necessarily aid me well. But because of my interest in preventative medicine, there was this really great nephrology kidney disease program in Toronto. My dad's friend ran it. And I was interested in all of the work that they were doing. Every time he would come over and they would share stories. So they decided one summer when I was 15 that they would trade kids for the summer, because the friends' kids wanted to do law. So everybody shuffled. I had no interest in law. So I went and I joined this nephrology practice as a summer student. And I was assigned to work with a brand new young doctor who just finished his fellowship and had to do some grunt research assignments as part of his initiation to the nephrology team. And his name was Jason Fong. So I was loved the patients. Everybody tried so hard. Like you hear all these stories about patients not being compliant. Not one like that I saw. Everybody wanted to do what they could to, at that end stage, to prevent going on dialysis or be as healthy as possible for a transplant. So it just felt so rewarding to try to work with these individuals. But unfortunately, we were just giving them the wrong advice. Like when I was 15 and I walked into that dialysis unit, we had a handful of people on dialysis a few times a week. And by the time I was 25, we had thousands of people on dialysis 24/7. And even we're in Toronto. I live in the Bay Area now. I'm from Toronto. And we were airlifting people to places like Ottawa, which is a 5-hour drive for dialysis, because we couldn't dialyze them in the city. Toronto is one of the, I think it's like the 3rd largest city in North America. Or it's definitely in the top 5. So we're not talking like small potatoes here. Like it's a city with millions and millions of people and resources. So it was just totally insane. And that was due to the epidemic that's type 2 diabetes. So in my mid-20s, you need to stop with the Happy Meals and Dominoes. You need to go back to what you were doing and get a dietitian and do all of this other stuff, because you're going to be on the fast track to death. But doing all of that stuff, which kind of in hindsight feels kind of dumb, because that's what I was doing with patients, and they were just becoming more and more sick. I reasoned at the time that we just started the interventions too late for them. But, at my age, I'm going to start them now, and it won't be too late for me. But, flash forward a year to just before my 27th birthday, I gained over 60 pounds and I had developed type 2 diabetes. And my doctors just kept labeling me as thyroid. But then they check, not thyroid hormones, pituitary hormones, and tell me that my thyroid was fine. So I must be eating Oreos by the box in the closet, and lying to them. Like I got treated like I was a criminal by these people. So, the diabetes diagnosis was terrifying because at that point, it was essentially just my job to watch people die from diabetes and to watch all of our interventions fail them. And Jason had some circumstances in his life that led him to wanting to research fasting. Like, why was it part of every major religion from the beginning of time? And was it just spiritual healing and cleansing, or was it some sort of physical medical side of it too? And he found it was very much both in every religion. So there were whispers around that Dr. Fung, he thinks he can cure type 2 diabetes through starvation. And there are whispers and little giggles. But I've worked with Jason now so long at that point that I knew Jason had some out of the box ideas, but I've never seen him be wrong. So I thought it was warranted a conversation. And then one day I overheard him giving a lecture on his own time to a small group of his patients who were willing to come in to have an extra session with their doctor. And it just all clicked. Like, it made so much sense. And it was so stupid because it was just so simple, right? Like how like it's 1 + 1 is 2. That's how simple the math was, with it, when it came to understanding fasting physiology and how it could prevent this chronic progressive disease. I know the ADA now says you can go into quote unquote remission with type 2 diabetes, but no, it's like you can prevent it and you can reverse it through meal timing and food, and really managing insulin levels. So I went through that evening, like all of the stages of emotions. And then the next day I did my first fast, and 6 months later, there's no diabetes, there's no PCOS, there's no fatty liver. I had lost the weight. I had lost even more weight trying to optimize my body composition. So I lost not weight rather, but I lost fat and I gained lean mass, and it just radically changed my life. And then we were fortunate to start in Toronto and in the clinic. Jason's written some books. We wrote a book together. So we've gotten a lot of attention about fasting. There's been some really good research on fasting and weight loss that's come out, some really good randomized control trials. So a little bit more acceptance from mainstream medical care. So a lot of referrals. And then we just decided you can't manage this in a clinical setting. So we started doing everything online, and that enabled us to serve people outside of the city of Toronto too, especially in the United States. And I live here now. In the US, like they've made it very clear, they're never going to change the cost of insulin, and it shall remain the most expensive place for insulin in the world. And, there's a time and a place for insulin. Sure. There's a time and a place for type 1 diabetics, but even type 1 diabetics don't need to take 200 or 300 units of insulin a day. A lot of them, can take a good, like 30, units a day and be fine. So there's a time and a place for it for sure. But in type 2 diabetes, there doesn't need to be a place for it. And then the cost of healthcare in this country is just so heartbreaking. Like once they moved online, I, would have these coaching calls with this gentleman who always took them in his car. And I just thought he wanted to take his calls in his car because he didn't want to take them in his place of employment. I wouldn't want to take a coaching call, in an open concept office when I'm talking about deep health matters. And I knew that his car had a lot of stuff in it, but at the time, it was before I started going to bed at 9:30. So back in those days, I had 8 pairs of shoes, 2 coats, 5 dresses, all of the things that young women tend to have in their cars. So I thought, okay, he's got a lot of stuff, but maybe he's just, messy like me. And 6 months after him coming off of insulin, he said, I know today's supposed to be a coaching call, but I want to show you something. And like, he showed me his first apartment that he's had in years because of the cost of all of his illnesses. He couldn't afford living. So he was living in his car. But with all of the money that he had saved on, because he had come off of insulin, he had come off of some oral diabetic meds, some blood pressure meds. He didn't have to see his doctor all of the time. There was less tests involved, that he could actually afford to have, a home and a roof over his head for the first time in many years. And so, diabetes is a huge problem all over the world. Status of healthcare, even in countries with public healthcare, we're losing it in Canada rapidly. So there's just all of these issues, and it's just so great to empower people to be in control of as much of their health as they can. There's going to be certain times where you definitely need to lean into traditional Western medicine, absolutely. But we can really reduce that risk of needing to do so. And I think at this particular time and place, it's more important than ever, to be in charge of our own health. And so much of that really comes down to controlling our insulin, PCOS, fatty liver, type 2 diabetes. Fatty liver and type 2 diabetes are the leading causes of death, in this country. So it's just really important to do that. And we can do that through fasting and through different nutritional means. And that's just really great, because then we get to hear awesome stories like that gentleman's and yours, and even live it ourselves like I have.
Yeah, that's amazing. What a really touching story about that man in his car. And it's just one of the many, many benefits of fasting is that this is a free modality. And so, of course, we don't see big pharma getting behind fasting because you can't monetize, can't really monetize it that much, of course, unless you're teaching it. But it's a beautiful thing to teach someone to do, and to, help them out with the different types of protocols and side effects. Because a lot of questions come up about fasting, and I mistakenly started my keto journey with a 3-day fast because I was so inspired by all the people doing extended fasting, and I had hypoglycemia and it was terrible. So I always tell people, don't do what I do. So what are some of the first things that you teach your patients about fasting, like that general backup, zoom out, this overview, the benefits of fasting, who is it for, who is it not for, and how would someone get started?
Generally, most adults in general can fast so long as there's not extreme nutrient deficiencies. And I've got to stress that even though we might be overweight, we might be very malnourished too. So it's good to get your nutrient levels looked at, and focus on eating some real foods wherever your nutritional desires go, at least getting in some actual nutrients instead of processed and refined garbage, or supplementing to bring up some nutrient levels. We had one patient, and I'm not trying to knock plant-based diets here.
It's okay. It's a safe space for doing that, I will tell you. But yeah.
Her skin was gray, like it was the color of my MacBook. And she was like the veggies, like potato chip sticks was her diet, like vegan ice cream. And it's just like, there's nothing. And her skin was gray, and she was trying to do all these 5-day fasts. It wasn't losing weight and was gaining weight. And she had a good 50, 60 pounds that she could lose. So, it wasn't like we were in a dire state, with lack of body fat for fuel, but her body was just under such extreme stress from her really nutrient void diet. And for reasons like she was just not going to, kind of radically shift her diet to something a little bit more paleo-esque, which would have been preferred at that point. But we tried to improve some nutrient profiles, and there was a lot of supplementation. But even then, bringing those nutrient statuses back up, she was able to fast and to lose weight. So it's good. We want to make sure we're in a society where we're often overnourished, but still malnourished from all of the processed and refined garbage that we consume. And then we tend to ask individuals to avoid fasting while pregnant or breastfeeding. But that doesn't mean that you should eat 100 times throughout the day either. I'm trying to conceal receive right now myself. I'm eating 2 meals a day, and trying to get in a variety of nutrients. And sometimes you might not be feeling well, and eating a little bit of food might help. And so 3 times, but there's no need to eat several times throughout the day. You can still maintain 14 or 16 hours of fasting, and same with breastfeeding. But when we start to get into some of the longer fasts, it can affect the quality of the breast milk. So, if the kid's a toddler, it's less of a concern if you're supplementing with breast milk here and there, but they're eating a good nutrient-rich diet otherwise. But when you have an infant, newborn, you don't want to mess around too much with the hormones. The thing with eating regularly versus fasting, eating promotes growth and fasting is anti-growth. And in the adult state, growth is usually very bad. You get nodules, you get cysts, you get tumors, you get diseases like cancer. Growth doesn't serve adults very well, like at all. The only real exception is, producing life, where growth is important. So during pregnancy and then nurturing that, child with breastfeeding, especially for like the first, 6 to 12 months after, if you make that choice to do so, and then, you want to kind of embrace a little bit of growth, because it's a safe growth. It's a healthy growth to have, but don't go wild with it. It's not a free pass to not at least do time restricted eating, and to eat how our grandmothers and great grandmothers and great great grandmothers ate when they were pregnant, because it wasn't 7 times a day. It was, 2 or 3 meals a day, and not snacks and not processed and refined garbage. So that's my spiel on pregnancy and breastfeeding, because we get asked this all of the time. And then if you've got a present history of eating disorders, especially bulimia, and this is just due to fears of refeeding syndrome, where you go from a very low nutrient state to over consuming something and like shooting your phosphorus levels up through the roof, and it can be really quite dangerous. So we want people to make sure that they've had good healing, good recovering, have put in the work when it comes to their relationship in general with food before they introduce fasting. And I noted, I don't talk about it too much, but when I was 14, I had not the best relationship with food, because all of our traditional calories in, calories out stuff, we know that it's not effective. So people end up having to take it to the extreme when they're trying to be health conscious. And mine came from a health conscious place or a desire, but psychologically, physically, it ended up going to an unhealthy place. But I worked through that. And I, restored health, restored my nutrients, and was able to have a phenomenal relationship with food once I started fasting, because it gives you control, and you can be in the driver's seat, and you realize you can truly enjoy really great food and be in control of everything without having to micromanage things like calorie counting all of the time. So we just want to make sure any, eating disorders, they've been rectified and there's been some growth, and then and the person is physically safe to start fasting, and it can be a great tool for individuals. So those are sort of the do's and don'ts with fasting. We've seen some individuals too that have been struggling with some gnarly health issues, and they'll tell their doctors that, hey, I'm also doing this fasting, and the doctor will say, well, that's the cause of your health issues, that's the cause of your chronic migraines, it's the cause of the weird pains in your leg, that's the cause of the numbness you're experiencing. Go home and eat a meal, stop and pick up some fast food. It's just ludicrous advice. And then often some big picture issues are lingering, and they're not doing the investigation. So usually we'll tell people, if you got something going on, get a diagnosis, and then fasting can be a tool in your tool chest. Most likely that can be used, but while you're in the discovering phase as to what might be going on, maybe park the fasting. And there's definitely no harm in time restricted eating. Like, even thinking of my grandmother. So when I started fasting, everyone thought I was nuts. So here she goes, she's got an eating disorder. My mom was pressing my dad to get like power of attorney over me because he was a lawyer. And then my grandmother, who had dementia, she said, you shouldn't be eating all of the time. She's like, none of us got fat till we started having potato chips and cookies in the house all of the time. You know, we'd have them on Canada Day, or we'd have cookies at Christmas, but we didn't have them all of the time. And she said to my dad and his siblings, you ate breakfast, lunch, and dinner. And then when you left my house, you got fat. And he said, now you send your kids to school with pails of candy and treats, and they're fat. So there's no one needs to. She's like, I survived, my parents survived, we survived without all of this stuff. We did just fine. And we didn't have this, great illness, until they started eating all of the time. And my grandmother said, I was never sick till we started eating all of the time. So it's just kind of interesting, because if we look back, my grandmother would probably be about 90 if she was still with us, but her years of poor eating definitely caught up with her, and she passed in her 80s. But if we could look back just even to her generation, which wasn't that long ago, she's born in like 1930, or around the 30s. So, that's not that long ago. And they, 3 square meals a day. And they had a lot less health issues until the late 70s and the early 80s, when everything started to radically change. We started eating fake foods, not real foods. We stopped eating nutrients, and we started suddenly being encouraged to eat all of the time. And I was working with a group this morning, and they're all wearing CGMs. They're some fancy business people, and they're doing this experiment where it was just the baseline, but they're going to wear their CGMs. So they're eating several times throughout the day, because that's what they're used to eating. And they were all mortified about their blood sugar levels. They're like, nothing can be good about sustaining blood sugar levels that are like 200 all day long from eating like the standard North American diet. Why on earth is this the advice we're giving out to diabetic patients? Of course, if you eat this garbage that they recommend, and then you eat all day long, like, it's not like you're maintaining your blood glucose level at like 90, you're maintaining it at like 200, and that's not even a worst case diabetics, situation. So they were just kind of mortified with the advice once they started actually seeing the data. So the advice out there is just so crazy. And I've totally started going on a tangent.
No,
here.
I love it. I love hearing all this, because it's so true that if you are just eating by default, you are just eating what's there, you're going to not be eating really nutrient dense foods. So you're going to be spiking your blood sugar. It's going to be dropping. And then that's going to send your body perceives that energy crisis. We're running out of fuel because obviously the insulin's high. Now we can't burn our body fat for fuel or get that glycogen from the liver because the insulin is blocking that. So we're going to be dependent on having more carbs to get our energy up. So it's sort of setting you up to eat multiple times a day. Like, that's why in the 70s, 80s, well, like 80s and 90s for sure, when there was low fat, they would tell us eat multiple times a day. Well, you had to, because there is no way that you were eating, 1 packet of maple and brown sugar oatmeal for breakfast with skim milk and making it through to lunch. Like, you were having to have snacks in that, in between. So the types of foods that are very readily available, these common foods, convenience foods, snack foods, they are not keeping us full. And so we have to eat more often. You can't just white knuckle it, because you're going to feel like garbage because your blood sugar is going to be dropping. So we definitely lost that. And we ate more times. We ate higher glycemic foods in the 80s and 90s. And that's when the rates of diabetes and obesity started really, really skyrocketing, along with the advent of all these vegetable oils. I feel like it's like sugar, flour, vegetable oils, processed foods. It's just the perfect storm for, a diabetes epidemic, it's sad, but it's just the default for so many people, because this is what we were raised with, because we were told to eat this way. We were just following the rules. I remember looking at that food pyramid. I don't know if y'all had that in Canada, but we had that food pyramid with 11 servings of grain on the bottom. I used to look at that on my cereal box, all the time when I was growing up in the 90s. So it's just how we were raised. And so I'm not surprised that those those businessmen were saying that their blood sugar was just super high all day. So yeah, makes sense.
That's just totally wild. Like, thinking back to like how my parents grew up, like in conversations now, because my father is a convert now for sure, and he fasts and he's come off of diabetic meds and he's lost weight. But he's like, wow, like a real wild, like on a regular basis, it would be really wild if his mom sent him to school with an apple, like with his real food lunch. Like that's just not how they grew up. He's like, yeah, and a big holiday thing, we would have, some of these processed stuff would start to linger as they became available. But like this is just not how they ate. Like they were eating mostly real foods and not very often. And their default state was fasting as a result. So when we're working with new individuals, it's we do, like, we have jump started people with some longer fasts or some in betweens with alternate daily fasting. But a good approach to try to boycott or mitigate potential issues that you might have from mostly keto flu-like symptoms, but it still never feels good to have flu-like symptoms, especially when you're trying to improve your health. You don't want to feel worse and still function while you're doing these things in your day-to-day life, is to really go back to how my grandparents, my great-grandparents ate, and find these real foods again and cut out the snacking and doing these daily 14-hour fasts. That's a really great way to ease yourself into it. And even then, we find sometimes people still struggle with the keto flu because they're eating so much processed and refined junk. There's so much, I'm a huge fan of salt. I have a whole plate of different types of salts on my dining room table. People come over and think I've got mental illness, but I think
I want to see your salt plate. I'm jealous. I carry like Redmond's real salt wherever I go. So I have the little containers, and so I'll be at a restaurant. My friends will be like, do you have the salt? I was like, yeah. I take it out of my purse. Like I'm always packing salt wherever I go, because it's just, I can't drink water without salt anymore because it feels so dehydrating, because I'm so used to it from fasting, from low carb, from keto, but also just because plain water is just dehydrating. It does just flush those minerals right out.
Yeah, even adding salt, I think, to coffee and to tea when you have it is really important too, if that's something that you do consume, to people listening out there. So adding a pinch of salt can go a long way to helping you. But with people with these processed foods, like they're just insulin spiking. Insulin causes water retention. You get blamed for the salt, but if your insulin's high, then salt's more likely to make you retain some water. It's just like bad news, like the North American diet in so many ways. So even just cutting out those foods and eating 3 meals a day, people can often still feel like garbage. But the good news is it passes within a week or two. And then most people find that they'll almost say that their stomach has shrunk. Like it went from the size of a tire to the size of a pea. And your stomach doesn't physically shrink. It's just hormones changing. So then people will naturally start cutting out meals. And I work with a lot of diabetic patients, postmenopausal women in general, or women going through menopause. So they're struggling with a dawn effect in the morning time, so their blood sugar levels are being driven elevated in the morning, and that's going to have its own insulin response within the body. So it's kind of just silly to eat. If your blood sugar is going up on its own and causing the insulin to go up without you even putting anything in your mouth, why would you add fuel to a fire? It's just totally insane. You want the fire to come out before you eat. So for this reason, when there are insulin resistant populations, we usually encourage people to skip breakfast, and it doesn't seem to have many hormonal detriments to postmenopausal women. Some women with reverse T3 and cortisol issues, they do have some benefits of eating breakfast as a meal, whether they're doing a 24-hour fast or as one of the meals on their eating day. And then in some cases with younger women too, there can be some benefits of having breakfast. But most people, they're not worrying about childbearing, type of stuff, or most women in general, then it's not really a a concern at that point. So, so cutting out breakfast is easy. Breakfast is such a pain anyways, because we're busy in the mornings, and there's, it's better to go out and get sunlight, go for a walk, breathe in fresh air than it is to have breakfast. You're going to nourish yourself so much more anyways. And then you let that sugar and that insulin fall in the morning before you eat. So people will transition from 3 meals and 14 hours of fasting to 2 meals and 16 to 18 hours of fasting. And in our program, we're really big on not snacking, because people just think that they get insulin resistance, which is the underlying cause of metabolic syndrome and the root cause of type 2 diabetes, PCOS, fatty liver disease, from eating processed and refined foods that have this significant insulin response. And that's a huge component of it too. But you can also develop insulin resistance from the chronic stimulus of insulin, even at a very, very low level over time. So we're not big proponents. No one with insulin resistance should be eating 8 hours or 6 hours of the day. We've got to evoke grandma times here and go back to having meals. So people go from 3 meals and 14 hours of fasting to 2 meals and 16 or 18 hours of fasting. And then eventually fasting starts to happen naturally. And then you can start to experiment with 24s where you're just having that one meal. And then you can, depending on your needs and your goals, you can amp it up to 24 hours. It's kind of a base level therapeutic fast for us, because we in our program are always trying to really treat insulin resistance, and we don't see insulin start to drop, till around like between hour 20 and 24. So our goal is not happening until the end of that 24-hour period. So we'll often ask people, sometime between 3 to 6 months, not forever, it's not a life sentence, but to, mix in some 36, 42, 48 hours of fasting. But you don't need to start there. You can absolutely gradually build yourself up. Some individuals are luckier than others. They can walk into a gym and start doing intensive weight training compared to their lack of activity and not hurt themselves. That's my husband. I, on the other hand, will end up in the ER if I do that. So I need to do a slow and gradual approach. So you might see people on Facebook or in a community like ours, who's like, "Ooh, I just conquered this long fast. And it's my, first month fasting." And that's someone like my husband who's, a bit of an anomaly in the gym. He just genetically has a better, body composition for strength training than I perhaps do, and a longer history with it than I have. But then there's people like us who need to start the fasting slow and gradually. And I started there. I kind of did the same thing as you, Danielle. I was like, oh, I'm so motivated right now. Like I've just learned that I've been lied to my entire educational career and professional career. And I had so many levels of anger. I'm like, I used to like tell people, "Oh, just skip the metformin crap. Go straight to insulin." And I've heard Jason say that. We said the most horrific things before we were reborn with the right information.
Yeah.
And so there was so much anger. And I'm like, I'm going to do a 7-day fast. I'm going to show the Canadian Diabetes Association just how much it freaking sucks and all of the crap. And I nearly died at the first day.
Oh my gosh.
But I started doing 16 hours, felt pretty good to me. I wasn't hungry in the morning. So 16, 18, I ended up varying, and then it was 24s. And then I got into a good cadence with some 42s and a 24 and a mix throughout the week. I do 2 42s and a 24. And then, I would occasionally interject some 3-day fasts. I did at one point, I did a series of 3-day fasts, one a week with some shorter 24s later on in the week. So it does get easier. In that, for my first 12 hours of fasting, I never thought there would be a day where I would eventually do, my longest fast was 11 days, or where I would quarterly do a 5 to 7 day fast. I didn't think that was possible, but fasting is like a muscle, and anyone is capable of building it. Some people just build it a little bit faster than others, but with consistent practice, everybody can get there.
Yeah, wow, I can't believe how much fasting you can do and do on a regular basis. Personally, I found that I needed to decrease my fasting a little because I was starting to get really cold whenever I fasted. And so I felt like I have my reverse T3 starts to go high. And so I do best with more of time restricted eating. And, I personally like to eat in the morning. Again, that reverse T3 thing. I like to eat in the morning and do more of a skip dinner because I like to eat early in the day. I'm always hungry in the morning and during the day. And then once, the late afternoon comes, it's almost like I never think about food. I don't like to go to bed with a full stomach. So that works well for me. And yeah, so um, in terms of fasting, so you mentioned time restricted eating. I mentioned it too. Can you compare and contrast that with fasting? Like, what are people, what does that mean? Also, I completely agree with the snack thing. I have a lot of posts that say there's no such thing as a healthy snack. And people are, are looking at me like, what are you talking about? And it's just like a crazy concept because snacking in and of itself is not healthy. So there could be a healthy food, but the premise is that snacking is not healthy. And I work with a ton of people with hypoglycemia and reactive hypoglycemia. So this fasting is not going to be relevant for them yet because this is also where I started. I was pretty hypoglycemic. My blood sugar would go low. So until I was in like a really deep level of ketosis and my blood sugar was going low, like I was fueled by ketones and then I eventually healed and now my blood sugar doesn't go that low anymore. So yeah, can you tell us a little bit more about time restricted eating versus fasting?
Yeah, so time restricted eating to us doesn't have the same therapeutic benefits as fasting, especially when you're trying to reverse disease like insulin resistant related conditions. So, with time restricted eating, you're just isolating your eating periods in a day. And there is some fasting, 12, 14, 16, 18 hours, depending on your various philosophies. In our program, it's 14 to 18 hours, typically in a time restricted eating day, where you have a fast and then you have this quote unquote eating window. I think where a lot of people get screwed up and don't see results is when they eat for that entire window. So if you're doing a 14-hour fast, that's not 10 hours of, oh, that looks good, or this looks good, or let me have a handful of that. That's not what it is. So we really, try to encourage people to eat at meals. And we do this thing called to help people train, because a lot of us, and me in particular too, just graze. Like we're chronic grazers. There's food everywhere.
That was me. Yeah.
Yeah, it's just wild. So like, how do you eat until you feel full, or how do you eat until you not feel full? How do you even have those, how do you even recognize what it is that your body needs? Like we become so blind and so deaf to our own bodies. It's just amazing. So we do this 90-minute thing with our community and our clients where you're at home. It doesn't take you hours to eat a meal, right? Like most people make a meal, they sit down and they eat it within half an hour. So we do these 3 30-minute blocks that total 90 minutes. And in block 1, you sit and you eat that meal that you've prepared. Most of us can, unless it's a holiday meal or we're out to dinner, we can eat that meal in 30 minutes without, scrambling to try to get it in. Then you wait for block 2. So for 30 minutes, you sit there and you wait for some signaling to start to happen. And you start to ask your body questions. Am I feeling satiated? If I'm not feeling satiated, what does that feel like? Am I craving certain things? What am I craving? So we actually do this check-in, towards the end of that second block, so we can actually connect our mind and our bodies together again, and we can start to learn what it is that we need. And then if people identify that there's sort of true need for more food for that 30-minute block or the third 30-minute block, then if they're craving fat, have more fat. If they're craving protein, have more protein. If they're craving sugar, have more protein and fat, in combination of both, and whatever you like, and top your bodies up for that 30-minute window. And what we find is people need to do this, but after several weeks, their brain and their body are their brain's recognizing signals and they're doing what they need. And that, they end up staying to block one, or maybe, block one, if it's more of a family meal, ends up being 45 minutes, and that's fine. But they're able to know what it is that they need on their plate in order to satiate them, or they're able to more quickly realize what it is that they're going to need depending on their particular cravings. Like, so often when we crave sugar, it's a big signal that we need more protein. So they're able to recognize this and be able to have meals. And then when you have a meal and feel satiated, it's really easy for you to go another 4 or 5 hours to have your second meal in the day. You don't need to snack. So we teach people how to eat a meal right. And then that way it eliminates a lot of the snacking in between. So for me, that's what time restricted eating is. We're not seeing like crashes in insulin levels. Like, insulin's not starting to go down to like hour 22. So we're not going to heal that. We're getting minimal autophagy. But of course, the more healthy you are, the less metabolic and insulin issues you have, the earlier on you'll enter autophagy. So for a very healthy individual, an 18-hour fast does, have some of those cellular recycling benefits that we look at for disease prevention. And there are some really great studies out there that show 14-hour fast has clinically significant reduction rates in certain types of like breast cancer, for example. So there are some therapeutic things happening, but when we look at these populations that have gotten these health benefits from these, time restricted eating versions of fasting, they're generally in a pretty healthy population to start with. So when we're looking to get healthy, you're going to maintain your progress and not make it worse, and, help, contribute in baby steps to making it better on time restricted eating days. And then our fasting days are more like 24, 36, 42, 48 hours, 2 to 3 times a week, when we're really trying to heal insulin resistance, because we're going to see the insulin levels come down dramatically. When that happens, the inflammation is going to come down dramatically. There's going to be a lot more autophagy, a lot more of that cellular recycling happen. You're going to get the production of these counter-regulatory hormones, which sometimes we're taught to fear and sometimes we're taught to embrace, depending on them. But the big difference between like a therapeutic fast versus, even time restricted eating, like a 14-hour fast, or like people will say, well, isn't fasting just extreme calorie restriction? And it's not. With fasting, therapeutic fasting, you get the activation of the sympathetic nervous system. And people say, well, it's a flight or fight nervous system. That can't be good. But there are benefits. It's all about finding a balance. And I'm sure many of your listeners are familiar with the concept of hormesis. You want to inflict some stress on the body, but not a ton. So like if you go to the gym, you're walking in for the first time in 6 months and you try to like bench press, twice your weight, you're probably going to injure yourself, right? But if you also like pick up like 2-pound dumbbells, you're not going to do anything good because you're not stressing your muscle and make little tears that will help it, grow. So you've got to find that balance where you're stressing the body some and versus stressing it a lot. And when you stress the body some, this is how we thrive. This is how human beings develop resilience, and how we prevent disease, and how we, evolve to be like better humans and create better humans. So we want to inflict some stress on the body. And that's what fasting and therapeutic fasting is. We get this activation of the sympathetic nervous system, but not in a tiger's in my face and is about to eat it off type of way, in a low grade way, just like lifting the appropriate weights at the gym would be a good amount of stress to help you grow your muscles. So with these counter-regulatory hormones, you do get some cortisol, which freaks people out, but it's a little bit of cortisol, and not having any cortisol is a really bad thing too. So we want to have a little bit, and this helps with gluconeogenesis. We do produce some glucose when we're fasting, and it's important that we do that. So the cortisol helps aid with gluconeogenesis in the liver. And then we produce human growth hormone, which is really really cool thing, because we don't make it much into adulthood anymore. We will produce some of it at night, but most people as they age stop sleeping very well. So that further diminishes a little bit that we're producing. So human growth hormone can help maintain our muscle mass, help keep us strong. So we love that. And then there's the noradrenaline that's produced when we're fasting too. And the noradrenaline helps us burn body fat, maintain our resting metabolic rate. Human growth hormone helps us do that as well. So you get these magical counter-regulatory hormones being produced in the fasting state. And this is why when you look at randomized control trials comparing alternate daily fasting of 0 calories versus just, reduce your caloric intake by 4 or 6 or 800 calories a day, why you see in the alternate daily fasting group every time is you don't see lean mass loss, or much less lean mass, because of course as you lose mass overall, your ratios are going to change and drop a bit, but you're not losing, you're not muscle wasting during these fasts. Whereas in the calorie restriction group, we see that, they don't get these magical counter-regulatory hormones. In calorie restriction, you're just limiting your body's energy budget, and your body rather, it will start to cut expenses, right? So we're going through weird global economic times. And, today I was reading some article about how Google's cutting back. They've laid off this many people, and they're cutting off on this projects to, to preserve what resources that they have. So we're hearing a lot about this from various companies, and that's what your bodies do on these calorie restriction diets. It's like, all right, we're going to cut the budget for the reproductive system. We're going to cut the budget for the respiratory system and the cardiovascular system. Oh, and let's slash the cognitive function by 30%. And then it learns to adapt to the new budget. So you don't get these great things happening, and you start to feel awful when you're doing calorie restriction diets. So the data shows, you don't maintain that lean mass in calorie restriction. You don't have that human growth hormone. You don't burn as much fat. The neat thing about the data, when you look at it, when you look at trunk fat, especially, so the fat around our midsections that we would often attribute to disease, there's greater trunk fat loss in the alternate daily fasting group than in the calorie restriction group. And then all of these RCTs that have come out in the last 10 years comparing both groups, we all see a clinically significant reduction in resting metabolic rate in the calorie restriction group. So we're seeing that the body has cut costs. It's had to, because it's not liberating resources. Whereas when you're in a fasted state, all of studies show that our resting metabolic rate relatively maintains. And that's because of counter-regulatory hormone. Like, oh, Megan's not eating. Okay, noradrenaline, human growth hormone, go. Release the fat stores, give her the fat fuel that she needs to get through the day. So the hormones, they retrieve from your system what it is you need to meet your energy demands. So, it's kind of like they only have so much cash in your wallet, but you got a big bank account, and you just have to go to the bank. And so when you fast, you're going to the bank to take out the resources that are in your big bank account to help. And so that's, really what we're doing, and how the two differ, calorie restriction and fasting, and really where we see the big difference between fasting and time restricted eating.
That's so helpful. And it's really cool to hear all those benefits of fasting when it comes to hormones, maintaining lean muscle mass, the cognitive benefits of just having this clear, sharp mind because of all those counter-regulatory hormones, and that we're not down-regulating our metabolism, which is really, really common when we do the calorie restriction. So many people, I've just been speaking to a lot of prospective clients, and they're like, oh, I've done so much calorie restriction. I was doing 1,200 calories a day for so long. And now if I eat anything over that, like I'm starting to gain weight. And it's that's what the body does. The body's super smart, and it's not going to keep burning more calories than you're getting. You know, it will do that at first, and then it's like, hey, this feels like a pattern. You know, Dr. Fung talks about that in his book, and it's like, yeah, you definitely don't want to keep restricting your calories like that, but you can use fasting as a beautiful tool to help cut some calories, but sort of in a better way, right? So you're not eating all throughout the day. And this has huge impacts also on our gut health, because when we're not meant to be grazing and eating all day, that's also not how our gut was designed. So when we are taking breaks from eating, our gut lining can repair, and we can, you know, have a lot of healing go on in the digestive tract and have more complete digestion. The other thing is we need a lot of bile to digest the healthy fats that we're eating in our meals. And if we're just grazing all day long and we're using some of that bile, by the time a meal comes, we may not have enough bile sort of stored up in the gallbladder to be used to digest this. So there's also digestive benefits to fasting. Anything else that we may have missed in terms of benefits? Obviously, fat loss.
I mean, the recovery, so insulin resistance is great. There's some like more flattering ones. Like I love it when a woman's like, my C-section scar is gone, you know, 30 years later. My kid has a kid, but my C-section scar is now gone.
How is that possible? That's
well, it's from
crazy.
autophagy, right? It's from the cellular recycling. And so, I mean, that has some vanity benefits. Like, I can't tell you the number of times I'd walk into a waiting room and be like, oh, patient so-and-so is not here. And I just didn't recognize them because it maybe had been about 6 weeks. You know, they were avid fasters at this point. They were off of insulin, but they just look so radically different. It's just wild. Or, you know, how people can lose 150 or 200 pounds and not have loose skin, you know, like when they're way into their 70s or even in their 80s. So we all know they're not training at the gym like a 19-year-old, right? So how is it possible? So the cellular recycling is really cool. And there's just infinitely deep possibilities, I think, when it comes to disease prevention. You know, Jason wrote a great book called The Cancer Code that goes into the insulin part of it too. But, you know, also the disease prevention aspect from incorporating fasting and autophagy. There's a lot of research being done on autophagy in neurological cases, Parkinson's disease, MS, and how the cellular recycling and cellular rejuvenation may be beneficial. You know, early Alzheimer's, dementia. I mean, we talked, you mentioned, you know, us referring to PCOS as diabetes of the ovaries, you know, Alzheimer's, dementia is just diabetes of the brain. Very few instances of Alzheimer's are genetic. And we would see low numbers of Alzheimer's in the population 30 years ago. We are not seeing low numbers of Alzheimer's disease in the population today. It's something that everybody's concerned about, family history or not. And now more people are getting it. So now more people think there might be, you know, they might be doomed from the genetic aspect. I'm like, no, this is nutritional. You just got diabetes of the brain and we need to treat that. So autophagy, I think it's going to be pretty cool to sort of see where the research goes. And there's different ways to get into autophagy. There's really intense exercising, which isn't always feasible for everybody to do. I mean, we've had patients in wheelchairs and patients with foot amputations, and they can be really challenging for certain individuals. And I was only 27 when I was diagnosed, but like I could barely shower. Like I didn't have the energy. So to go and to do some type of Arnold Schwarzenegger routine at the gym was not going to happen. He's the only bodybuilder I really know.
That's fine.
He's the only one that's not a client that I can talk about. So there's that aspect, ketogenic diet's definitely a great way. Fasting is a very turbocharged way to get a lot of autophagy happening in a shorter period of time. So I think fasting is going to be more useful in that. And it's interesting. I've got some intel into the pharmaceutical world. And there's a lot of companies that specialize in oncology meds that are looking to create certain meds that will induce autophagy in certain proteins and certain cells. And it's, they're going to spend mad amount of money. There are going to be tons and tons of trials. There's going to be potential side effects galore. Just fast. You'll be inducing autophagy in all of the cells and all of the proteins. Yes. It won't cost anybody anything. They can do it anywhere. No one has to suffer in the process, and they'll probably get 8 other health benefits too. Some other benefits of fasting, like we've heard, anxiety and depression, alleviating. I do think a lot of that's nutrition related as well. I don't think it's just straight fasting. I do think the fasting is a tool that helps. ADHD was something for me. I got to the point in my early 20s where I could not function if I wasn't on Vyvanse, which is like a more modern day Adderall. Yeah. And I just felt like I was losing my mind. And then, I just didn't need it anymore. I was twice as sharp without it than I was on it, once I got my diet right and got my health sorted out. So that's another great one. So, the sky, I think, is the limit from the benefits that you can get from incorporating some type of fasting into your routine.
Yeah, I love that. And thank you for sharing all of those. I was wondering if you had any just like clinical, because I know you said that you're looking forward to studies looking at fasting and Alzheimer's. Do you have any just like clinical experience with any sort of fasting with someone who may, like patients who have cognitive decline, dementia? Have you seen any improvements or any promising sort of case studies?
I don't have a ton of actual clinical experience with it. What we've had is we've got quite a few people that work with us who are terrified of this family history or have done the genetic testing to know. And they're looking to do everything that they can now for like disease prevention in the future. So it'll be really interesting to see the outcomes in that case. We worked with some people too after brain injuries to see if, fasting and ketogenic diets and different, versions of fatty nutrients can help with recovery, which has been pretty cool. We haven't published anything yet though on that. So I don't know of anything that's being done in the area of Alzheimer's right now, but I imagine it's there. We had some, and I understand for people who might be listening today, if you've got a relative who's got Alzheimer's disease, it can be heartbreaking, but it can be really difficult at the 11th hour to try to radically improve that. And like you have to be a very dedicated caregiver and be strategic and creative with it. So we've had a few people come to us, and it's like almost end stage, and they're trying to do what they can for their loved ones. And I get it. So my husband, his name's Angel, and all 4 of his grandparents had Alzheimer's, and none of it's genetic. It's all nutritional. So, for us, it's a really great motivator to, not be tempted on that hot summer's day to indulge in like ice cream. This is not genetic, but he is more prone to it. So it's been heartbreaking, like just, watching the decline. His uncle had Alzheimer's disease too, who passed. So I've experienced this through my husband. I've had dementia and my grandmother, and it was so tough for me being in the medical field. I learned to roll with it. If she thought she was living in a palace, then I let her think she was living in a palace. And, we had these lovely moments and conversations. but I grew up with her as a grandmother role. Her own kids, like, they struggled. It was very tough for them to see this brilliant, sharp pistol of a woman kind of decline. And they would have done anything, to help her. But in those late stages, it can be a little bit much to try to do the interventions. But theoretically, there's a ton of people out there. Dr. Terry Walls, we all know she's the neurologist, MS guru. So she's a neurologist who developed MS, who is more or less sent it into, total remission or reversal, depending on, I'm not sure how she classifies it herself. Through intermittent fasting and through her version of a ketogenic diet. And I've met these people, like, she'll do shorter fasts, and she talks about it in her book. And I think it's wonderful that she mentions it because it's so important. But I met people at conferences that, were diagnosed with MS early, and they followed her nutrition, got turned on to fasting because of her, then, started doing some more of the therapeutic ranges of fasting for more autophagy. And they're like, we're climbing Yosemite, like, it's
amazing.
It's just wild. Yeah, it's wild to hear that. So I think in early stages of Alzheimer's, we should hopefully be able to see those results.
Yeah, prevention is really so important. And unfortunately, it's not really what motivates people to do a lot of things, unless, of course, they have that very scary family history. When I was a speech pathologist, I worked in many nursing homes and skilled nursing facilities, and I saw people just declining. And with, at the end of these chronic progressive diseases, I saw so many people with diabetes and hypercholesterolemia, and, they'd have to go to dialysis, and, Parkinson's, ALS, MS, and Alzheimer's. There was a whole dementia unit, and I would see it all the time. And that was when I was first learning about my health, and I came across paleo, and I was like, thank goodness I found this, because I feel like I was on track to sort of being there. And I think that fear of, seeing this on a big scale, not like, oh, that won't happen to me. Like, you see just like average people who are living regular lives by default. They were just living their lives, and this is how they ended up. I feel like that's what will happen. That is the inevitable if you don't do some sort of intervention to prevent it, because that's the way the system is set up. That's the way our food system is. That's the way our lifestyles are, like with all the, artificial light, we're inside, there's all these toxins, there's so much stress. Like, we're not in a place where we're going to thrive unless we learn about it and unless we do some sort of intervention. And I think that, it's been so helpful listening to you talk about fasting. It's a free modality. There's so many benefits to it. You can do it anytime, anywhere. And it doesn't need to be something huge, start with those little things. Start with moving your dinner up an hour or your breakfast down an hour. Like, really start slowly. If you do have hypoglycemia or reactive hypoglycemia, please don't do this yet. Work with me first. We need to stabilize your blood sugar so that we can start to move that eating window in and start to bring down those insulin levels, which are driving your blood sugar too low to begin with. So fasting is one of the modalities, and fasting and keto are two modalities to heal and reverse hypoglycemia. But the problem is many of you guys are almost too sick for the treatment. So we have to work you there really, really slowly. And then we can start dabbling with these things. I have clients who I've worked with, and they're like, I skipped breakfast. Like, I used to eat 25 times a day to keep my blood sugar up. And now I ate 2 times a day, like, or 3 times a day and one snack. Like, it's just huge changes for them. And so eventually you can get there where your body's able to handle this type of hormetic stressor. So just like you were saying at the beginning with that woman who was eating a standard North American plant-based junk food diet, she was too sick to get the benefits. And so not everyone can get the benefits right away, but it doesn't mean you shouldn't work towards them, because it's just like, oh, my ankle's sprained, so exercising isn't good for me. It's like, Well, you want to heal your ankle so that you can exercise because you want the benefit of that stressor, right? So it's the same concept with healing your reactive hypoglycemia or hypoglycemia so that you can dabble with some of these fasting modalities, time restricted eating and things like that, so we can give our system a break. We can bring those insulin levels down. So Megan, thank you so much for being here. Can you tell people where they can find you and just more about how we can connect with you?
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks for having me on too, Danielle. It's been great to connect with your community. If you want more interested or more information about what it is that we're up to, I always feel like we're up to 1,000 crazy things. You can head on over to thefastingmethod.com. So various programs linked to free social resources. We've got like 1,000 blog posts that are free for anyone who wants to come to our site to learn more about fasting. So a tremendous amount of free resources. You'll find both mine, Jason's, and the Fasting Methods social links. Jason's book, our book, Life in the Fasting Lane, everything's on that main hub. So if you go there, you should be able to find it. And, fasting is a pretty cool tool to have in your tool chest. And so you don't have to go crazy with it. Like you see people doing sometimes, although sometimes going crazy with it, works well for certain individuals. But it's a tool that can help most people. So it's a great one to experiment with, talk with your team to see if it's a good fit for you or when it might be a good fit for you to start to incorporate it.
Right. And we didn't mention, but probably should, if you are, on any sort of medications, things like that, you always want to be working with a skilled practitioner to help you along. So I don't want to say like work with your doctor because oftentimes they're maybe unfamiliar. So make sure you work with a medical professional who is familiar with and capable of helping you navigate with your medications. Yeah.
Yeah. So it's important. You want to make sure, especially heart medications, diabetic medications, that they're being adjusted accordingly so you don't end up with complications. But the great news is, if it works, you can start to come off these medications, and it's really cool not to live a life tied to a pharmacy.
Yes, absolutely. I help a lot of people get off a lot of medications, most notably blood pressure, thyroid, and anxiety meds. Those are the top 3 that people come off of. And there's just I feel like there's no better feeling than someone being like, I got to get off this medication. It's like, yes, we're doing the reverse because, you're put on medications and it's like, you're on this. This is what you do now. And how amazing is it to do the reverse? So I know that you probably do that on a daily basis. So it must be really, really exciting. So thanks again for coming on, and we'll all contact you or find your socials. I'll put all the links in the show notes. And do you have any active podcasts? That was the last thing I wanted to ask.
So we have the Fasting Method podcast. We just launched our 2nd season. So we trying to really stick about practical fasting information. Every now and then we have on a guest, but we really just try to answer questions or talk about hot fasting topics. So check it out if you're interested. It's the Fasting Method podcast. It's with myself and my colleague, Dr. Nadia Pataguana. She's our baby maker. She's our PCOS expert. She wrote the PCOS plan with Jason Fung, and she can get anyone pregnant. That's what I've concluded.
She can get anyone pregnant.
Yeah. Don't.
I love that. That's great. That's really great to hear. I'll have to have her as a guest on my show as well, because obviously PCOS is a topic near and dear to my heart. So thanks again, Megan. We'll talk to you soon.
Thanks, Danielle. Thanks, everyone.